Sophie stood at the edge of the old riverbank, her bare toes digging into the cool dirt as the fading summer sun cast a golden shimmer across the water. She was 15, all wild hair and scraped knees, laughing breathlessly as she looked up at Daniel, the boy she'd followed around since childhood. He was 20, tall and already carrying the weight of his family's crumbling fortune on his shoulders, his dark hair falling over eyes that seemed far older than they should have been. That evening was meant to be their last before his family left town, a quiet goodbye at the place they had always shared, but Sophie had clung to hope like a lifeline. "Promise me," she had said, her eyes stubborn and wide, "promise me that if you come back in 10 years and we both still remember, you will marry me." Daniel had laughed softly, ruffling her hair with a grin. "That is a long time, little one." "I am not little," Sophie had snapped, her cheeks flushed. "You are the one leaving." His smile had softened as he reached down and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You will forget me, Soph. You will meet someone better." "I will not," she had whispered fiercely. "I will wait." He leaned down, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "Then I promise, 10 years from now, I will find you." That night, as the moving truck drove away, Sophie had stood by the road, clutching a small folded letter she had slipped into his bag. When he was not looking, the words, simple and messy, "Please, do not forget me." The years rolled on faster than either of them could have imagined. Sophie finished high school, enrolled in college with dreams of architecture, and then watched helplessly as her father's company collapsed under bad debts and poor health. Her family sold the house, traded their once comfortable life for a cramped apartment, and Sophie abandoned school to work full-time, juggling jobs to keep the lights on. She never forgot Daniel, though sometimes she wondered if she had imagined the promises of youth. Meanwhile, Daniel carved his name into the world with ferocious determination, driven by the shame of his family's fall, clawing his way up through long hours and brutal negotiations, building an empire before he was 30, his name whispered across boardrooms as both a genius and a storm. Yet behind every closed deal, every late night, every victory, one memory stayed: the girl by the river who had made him promise, the girl who had never left his heart. He searched quietly, carefully, afraid of what he might find, until one day he found Sophie's name tangled in the records of a dying company, her father's last failing venture already being circled by corporate predators. She was no longer the carefree girl he remembered. She was standing on the edge of ruin, cornered by a rival who offered her one devastating choice. One night, one price, and her family's debt would disappear. Sophie, trembling but determined, had almost agreed when Daniel stepped into the room. "Wait," Daniel's voice cut through the silence, smooth and sharp. "You are offering her family's freedom for one night?" The rival smirked, thinking he had won. Daniel met Sophie's wide, panicked eyes, and something old and fierce rose in his chest. "I will offer $10 million, Daniel said calmly, "for one night with her." Sophie gasped softly, her mind spinning. She did not recognize the man in front of her, not yet, not the boy who had kissed her forehead at the riverbank, not the man who had built an empire, just to return for a promise. She only knew her world had just changed, and she did not know why her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Daniel Reese had been born into a world of polished glass and silk ties, his childhood filled with boardroom conversations and expectations no child should have to carry, yet none of that had protected him when the family empire crumbled. At 20, he had left his hometown with nothing but a battered suitcase and a stubborn belief that he could build something better, not just to erase the shame attached to the Reese name, but to prove to himself that he was more than a fallen heir. 10 years later, he stood as one of the youngest billionaires in the country, the CEO of Reese Global, a towering figure in finance and technology, known as much for his ruthless business tactics as for his complete emotional detachment. He had everything, yet, behind the penthouse windows and tailored suits, Daniel lived with one haunting memory: the girl by the river who had made him promise, the girl he had left behind. Sophie Callahan, on the other hand, had grown up in a house filled with laughter and warmth. Her father a respected businessman, her mother a woman who organized charity events and baked on Sundays, and Sophie herself a bright-eyed dreamer with sketchbooks full of architectural designs. But life had turned sharply against them, her father's business slowly drowning in debt, illness striking when they least expected, and no amount of charm or past reputation could save the Callahans from slipping into the shadows. By 25, Sophie was no longer the girl who danced barefoot in the garden. She was a woman balancing overdue bills, hospital visits, and the heavy knowledge that she could not fix everything alone. She had not thought about Daniel in years, or at least she told herself she had not, pushing his memory into the back of her mind as she focused on surviving. Until now, standing in an office far too cold and sharp, facing a man she despised, one of her father's old rivals who had made her an offer she could barely comprehend. One night, one act, and her father's debts would be erased. Sophie had felt her world tilt, shame rising hot in her chest, the weight of sacrifice pressing down. She had clenched her fists, ready to speak, when the door opened. Daniel had entered like a storm in a suit, his presence swallowing the room, sharp eyes locking instantly onto Sophie, though she did not recognize him. To her, he was a stranger, a man whose offer stunned everyone present, $10 million for one night, but only on his terms. To the rival, it was an absurd bid, one that could not be matched. To Sophie, it was a lifeline she did not understand. She had stared at him, wide-eyed, trying to place his face, feeling something in her chest stir and ache without knowing why. Behind the scenes, Daniel had already dismantled the rival's empire, quietly buying up stakes, weakening his position, preparing to crush him entirely. But this moment was not about business. This was about Sophie, the girl he had promised to find, the girl he had spent a decade searching for, only to discover her standing at the edge of ruin, ready to give herself away out of desperation. Daniel could not allow that, not because of pride, not because of ego, but because deep down she was still his Sophie, and he was still the boy who had promised to come back for her. New York City shimmered outside the high-rise windows, cold and indifferent, a city where fortunes were made and broken overnight, where names rose and fell with a single headline. Daniel had conquered this city, bent it to his will, but as he looked at Sophie now, he realized none of it mattered if she did not see him, if she did not remember. She was dressed simply, nothing like the glamorous women who circled his world, her hair pulled back hastily, her eyes wide with worry and defiance, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to understand what was happening. She was still beautiful, but more than that, she was still Sophie, the girl who had once promised to wait. Sophie felt like the air had been sucked from the room. She could barely process the shift in power, the sudden intrusion of this man, his offer, his intense gaze. Why would a stranger care what happened to her? Why would anyone offer such a sum for something so personal, so painful? She wanted to ask, wanted to shout, wanted to run, but something in the way he looked at her made her freeze. It was not hunger or arrogance. It was something else, something that made her chest tighten with a strange, inexplicable pull. As Daniel stood there, calm and unreadable, he knew this was only the beginning. 10 years of silence could not be erased in a single night, and Sophie would not remember him easily. But he was here now, standing before her, ready to pay any price, not for her body, but for the chance to fulfill a promise that had never truly been broken. That night, Sophie found herself in a hotel suite she could barely comprehend, walls of soft cream, floors of polished marble, windows stretching from floor to ceiling, offering a view of New York, glittering like a dream. She sat stiffly on the edge of an armchair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, heart racing so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the room. Daniel stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and for the first time Sophie noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at her without speaking. She cleared her throat, trying to gather her courage. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you pay so much for someone you do not even know?" Daniel turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers, the weight of it almost too much. "I know you, Sophie," he said quietly. "I have always known you." She shook her head, confusion rising. "You are a stranger. I have never met you before." His jaw tightened for a moment. Then he walked closer, stopping just a few feet away, his voice dropping lower. "Do you remember the boy who promised to come back for you?" Her breath caught, her eyes widening, her heart skipping painfully in her chest. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It cannot be." He nodded once, a small, almost sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I promised, Soph. I promised 10 years ago that I would come back, and I never break my promises." Sophie felt her vision blur, tears stinging her eyes, memories flooding back with dizzying force, the riverbank, the laughter, the goodbye, the letter she had slipped into his bag when he was not looking. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, shaking her head as if to clear the rush of emotions. "I thought you forgot," she choked out. "I thought you moved on, became someone else, someone who left all this behind." Daniel crouched slightly, reaching for her hands, his touch gentle, grounding. "I never forgot. Not for a day. Everything I built, everything I fought for, it was to keep the promise I made to you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to fall into his arms and pretend the years had not stretched between them like a canyon. But reality pressed in hard, her family's ruin, the debts, the shame. "You cannot fix this, Daniel," she whispered, pulling her hands back. "You cannot buy away the mess my life has become, and I cannot let you carry it for me." His eyes softened, a flicker of pain passing through them. "I am not here to fix you, Soph. I am here because I want to stand beside you. Not because you need saving, but because I have never wanted anyone else." For the next few hours they sat together in that room, not touching, not crossing any lines, simply talking, the words spilling out like they had been waiting for years. Sophie told him about her father's collapse, her mother's quiet despair, the weight she carried trying to hold everything together. Daniel told her about the endless grind of building Reese Global, the sleepless nights, the victories that felt empty, the hollow relationships, the ache of missing something he could never replace. Somewhere between confession and silence, Sophie began to see past the billionaire facade, past the sharp suits and headlines, and found the boy she had once known, still stubborn, still fierce, still looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. But with closeness came fear. Sophie pulled away slightly, her voice trembling. "This cannot work, Daniel. Our worlds are too different. You live up here above everything, and I am still drowning down there. You will get tired of rescuing me, and I will get tired of feeling small." Daniel shook his head, his expression fierce. "Do not say that. Do not reduce yourself. You have always been the strongest person I know. You held your family together when everything else fell apart. You have more courage in one breath than most people I know have in a lifetime." She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I am scared," she admitted softly. "I am scared to believe this is real. Scared that if I let you in, it will all fall apart." Daniel stepped closer, reaching for her hands again, his voice steady. "I am scared too, Soph, but I would rather be scared with you than be safe without you. I am not asking you to trust me overnight. I am just asking you to let me be here." Over the following days, their connection deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. Daniel would show up at the small cafe where Sophie worked part-time, slipping into a corner seat with a book, watching her laugh with customers, watching her move with a quiet grace she never noticed in herself. Sophie would receive anonymous deliveries, groceries for her family, medical supplies for her father, never signed but always arriving, just when they were needed most. At first, she wanted to push back, to tell him she did not need his charity, but deep down, she knew this was not about pity. It was about a man who had waited 10 years to keep a promise, who was determined to stand beside her, whether she wanted him to or not. Late one night, Sophie found herself back in Daniel's apartment, a storm raging outside, wind rattling the windows. She sat curled on his couch, sketchbook in hand, her hair loose and damp, her bare feet tucked under her. Daniel emerged from his study, watching her quietly for a moment before crossing the room and sitting beside her. "You always draw when you are restless," he murmured, and she smiled softly. "You remember that?" He nodded. "I remember everything." She hesitated, then set the sketchbook down, turning to face him fully. "Daniel, why me? Why hold on to something for so long, when you could have had anyone, when you could have forgotten?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Because you are the only person who ever saw me. Not the name, not the money, just me. And because when I was 19 and scared and angry at the world, you believed in me, I never stopped needing that." Sophie's heart squeezed painfully, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his cheek, and for the first time in years Daniel leaned into the touch, closing his eyes briefly when he opened them again. His voice was rough. "I do not want to rush this, Soph. I do not want you to ever wonder if I am here because of a deal, or a debt, or a promise. I am here because I choose you, every time." She felt the tears spill over then, silent and unstoppable. And when Daniel reached for her, she let herself fall forward, burying her face in his chest, feeling his arms wrap around her tightly, securely, as if he had been waiting his whole life to hold her again. That night they did not cross any lines, they simply held each other, wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than any words, a silence filled with all the things they were still afraid to say, but no longer willing to run from. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she could breathe, and Daniel, for the first time since becoming a billionaire, felt like he had finally come home. Days passed, each blending into the next. Sophie found herself navigating a strange new balance. Her mornings spent working double shifts to keep her family afloat, her evenings tangled in quiet moments with Daniel, moments she had never imagined would belong to her. He did not push, did not press. He simply showed up, steady and unshakable, sitting beside her on late nights when exhaustion pulled at her bones, bringing her coffee without asking, listening as she vented her frustrations about her family's crumbling life. Slowly, Sophie began to understand that Daniel's presence was not a grand gesture or an act of charity. It was simply a man trying to rebuild a bridge he had never wanted to lose. Yet no matter how much time they spent together, a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface. Sophie kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment Daniel would remember who he was, waiting for the moment she would become just another responsibility he was tired of carrying. Her doubts gnawed at her when he was not looking. In the silence of her tiny bedroom at night, she wondered what they were really doing, wondered if she was falling too hard for something that could never be real. One afternoon, Sophie came across an old photo album buried in her mother's closet, pages yellowed, edges curled, and there, tucked between two faded pictures of her father's old company events, was a small note in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her own, childish and clumsy. She pulled it out carefully, reading the simple words she had written so long ago, the letter she had tucked into Daniel's bag the day he left. It said, "I will wait, and I will grow up. And when you come back, I will not cry anymore." Sophie sat on the floor, staring at the note, her chest tightening painfully. That evening, as the city pulsed outside the apartment windows, she brought the note to Daniel. her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it to him. "I found this today," she said softly. "I forgot I even wrote it." Daniel took the paper gently, his eyes tracing the familiar lines, his jaw tightening as he swallowed hard. "I never forgot," he murmured. "I carried this with me through every job, every failure, every success. I built everything I have because of this promise." Sophie's heart clenched, her voice barely a whisper. "You built an empire because of a 15-year-old's letter." Daniel looked at her, his gaze fierce. "I built it because you believed in me when no one else did, because you saw something in me I could not even see myself, because I wanted to come back and be someone worthy of you." Sophie felt her breath hitch, tears stinging her eyes. She shook her head. "I do not understand how you can see me like this, after everything, after how far apart our lives have become." Daniel reached for her hands, his grip firm. "Because you are the only person who has ever mattered, Soph. Money, power, none of it means anything if you are not standing beside me." But as they began to close the distance between them, the outside world started to creep in. Whispers began circulating through the business press, tabloids hinting at the mysterious woman the billionaire was seen with, headlines questioning who Sophie was, speculating on her connection to Daniel, some painting her as a gold digger, others as a scandal waiting to explode. Sophie saw the articles and felt the ground shake beneath her, fear clawing at her chest. She tried to shield her family from the rumors, tried to tell herself it would pass, but the weight grew heavier with every passing day. Late one night, Sophie confronted Daniel, her voice tight with frustration. "I cannot do this. I cannot live under a spotlight I never asked for. I cannot be the reason people question you, question your work, your reputation." Daniel frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. "Soph, none of that matters. Let them talk. Let them guess. I know the truth, and you know the truth. That is enough." "But it is not enough," she said, her voice cracking. "You have a world to protect, a company, a name, and I have nothing left but the scraps of a family I am barely holding together. We are not equals, Daniel. We never were." He reached for her then, his voice rough with urgency. "Stop. Stop tearing yourself down. You are not a burden. You are not a project I am trying to fix. You are the only part of my life that feels real." Sophie pulled away, shaking her head. "I need time, Daniel. I need space to figure out who I am outside of this, outside of you." He froze, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like fear. "You are walking away." Sophie's heart clenched, her voice soft. "I am not walking away forever. I just need to stand on my own, even if just for a little while." That night they parted quietly, no slammed doors, no angry words. Just two people standing at the edge of something fragile, unsure if it would hold or shatter. Daniel sat alone in his apartment long after Sophie left, the city lights reflecting in the glass as he stared at the letter she had given him, his chest heavy with the realization that for all his power, all his resources, he could not control the one thing that mattered most, her choice to stay or leave. Sophie, meanwhile, returned to her small apartment, curling up on the couch with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to steady the ache in her chest. She missed him already, missed his steadiness, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. But she also knew she needed to reclaim the parts of herself she had lost, the parts buried under years of sacrifice and survival. As the days passed, neither of them reached out, both stubborn, both scared, both waiting for the other to make the first move. Daniel threw himself into work, taking meetings late into the night, his mind restless, his chest hollow. Sophie focused on her family, helping her father transition out of the business, helping her mother adjust to a quieter life, trying to remind herself that she was strong enough to stand alone. But neither of them could forget, and neither of them truly wanted to. It had been 10 days since Sophie and Daniel last spoke. 10 long days where the city moved on without them. The news cycle shifted, new scandals took over, but inside their private worlds, nothing felt settled. Daniel sat in his corner office overlooking Manhattan, hands steepled under his chin as his assistant rattled off details about upcoming mergers, meetings, deadlines, but his mind kept drifting, his chest heavy with the absence of Sophie. He had told himself to give her space, to let her breathe, but the silence was starting to eat away at him. Sophie, on the other hand, was busy helping her parents pack up their small apartment. Her father had officially stepped away from his company. Her mother was adjusting to a simpler life, and Sophie was trying her best to keep everything running smoothly. Yet at night, when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, it was not the bills or the responsibilities that kept her awake. It was the memory of Daniel's voice, the way he had looked at her with a mixture of longing and fear, the way she had walked away even when her heart screamed to stay. One evening, Sophie received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. "Hello." The voice on the other end was familiar, warm, and slightly amused. "Sophie, it has been a while. How are you?" She blinked, recognizing the voice as Claire, Daniel's longtime legal advisor. "I am fine," Sophie said carefully. "Why are you calling?" Claire chuckled softly. "I am calling because Daniel is driving everyone insane. He is working himself to the bone. He is barely sleeping. And none of us can get through to him. But you are the only one who has ever been able to get through that stubborn head of his." Sophie's heart clenched. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Claire, I do not know if I should. I do not want to make things worse." Claire's voice softened. "Sweetheart, you are not making things worse. You are the only good thing that has happened to him in years. And if you walk away now, you will both regret it." That night, Sophie found herself standing outside Daniel's building, nerves twisting in her stomach. She took a deep breath and entered. The elevator ride felt endless, her heart pounding as she reached the penthouse floor. When the doors opened, she found him standing by the window, his back to her, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. She stepped in quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "You are working too much." Daniel turned slowly, his eyes wide, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. "Sophie," his voice was rough, raw. "I was starting to think you were not coming back." She took a shaky breath. "I almost did not. I thought I needed to prove something, prove that I could stand on my own, but then I realized I do not want to stand on my own, not if it means standing without you." Daniel crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands reaching for hers, his voice low and urgent. "I do not want you to stand without me. I want you to stand with me as my partner, as my equal, not as someone I need to save, but as someone I want to share everything with." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her fingers tightening around his. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of messing this up, of not being enough." Daniel cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You are already enough, Soph. You always have been. You always will be." For a long moment they simply stood there, the world outside fading away, the silence between them soft and full. Then Daniel leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a whisper. "I love you. I have loved you since the day you made me promise to come back, and I will keep loving you every day we are given." Sophie let out a shaky laugh, her hands sliding up to rest on his chest. "I love you, too. I think I always have, even when I tried to forget." In the days that followed, they began to rebuild, not just their relationship, but the pieces of their lives they wanted to share. Daniel involved Sophie in his work, showing her the projects he was passionate about, asking for her opinions, valuing her insights. Sophie introduced Daniel to the small but important parts of her world, her family, her art, her dreams that she had buried under years of survival. Together they began to weave something new, something that belonged to both of them. Yet the world did not stay silent. The media caught wind of their reconciliation. Headlines swirled, cameras flashed, People speculated, but this time Sophie stood tall beside Daniel, her head high, her voice steady. She no longer flinched at the whispers, no longer shrank from the attention, because she knew the truth. She knew who she was, and she knew who they were together. One night, as they stood on Daniel's balcony, the city sprawling below, Sophie turned to him, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if we would have found our way back without all of this? Without the deals, the rivalries, the chaos?" Daniel smiled softly, wrapping his arms around her. "I think we were always going to find each other, Soph. It was never about the money, never about the power. It was always about the promise, the one we made when we were too young to understand what it meant. But somehow, still knew it mattered." Sophie leaned into him, her heart full, her fears quieted. She realized then that love was not about perfection, or certainty, or even about always knowing the right thing to do. Love was about showing up, again and again, even when it was hard, even when you were scared. It was about choosing each other, every single day. As autumn settled over the city, Sophie found herself falling into a rhythm she had never expected. She spent her mornings sketching designs she had long buried, afternoons helping her parents adjust to their quieter life, and evenings with Daniel, curled up beside him in the penthouse that had once felt intimidating, but now felt like a strange comforting second home. Daniel, too, seemed to transform. The man once known for long hours and endless strategy meetings was suddenly cutting his workdays short, prioritizing late dinners with Sophie, walking her home through quiet streets, watching her with a soft smile that no one at the office would have believed possible. But no matter how happy they were, the world around them kept pressing in. One evening, as Sophie entered Daniel's office, she noticed his assistant, Claire, standing stiffly outside the door, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Claire's eyes flicked to Sophie with an unreadable expression before she gave a small, polite nod and walked away. Inside, Daniel sat at his desk, his brow furrowed as he stared at a document, his fingers tapping restlessly against the wood. Sophie crossed the room slowly, her voice gentle. "What is it, Daniel? What is wrong?" He looked up, his eyes shadowed, his jaw tight. "There is something I need to tell you, something I just found out, something you deserve to know." Sophie's heart clenched, her breath caught. She sat down across from him, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "Tell me," she whispered. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice low. "The night I offered $10 million for you, it was not just to save you from my rival. It was because I had already bought out his company. I already owned his debts. I was already positioned to take everything from him. But I let the deal play out because I wanted to step in myself. I wanted to be the one who saved you." Sophie stared at him, her mind spinning, her voice barely a whisper. "You were never just a stranger walking in. You were orchestrating everything." Daniel's shoulders tensed, his eyes pained. "I wanted to tell you, Soph, but I was afraid. I was afraid you would think I was playing some kind of game. I was afraid you would walk away before I had a chance to explain. I was afraid of losing you before I even had you." Sophie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, her chest tightening. "You promised you were not trying to fix me. You promised you were standing beside me, not above me, not pulling strings behind my back." Daniel reached for her hands, his grip firm, his voice urgent. "I meant every word, Soph. I never wanted to control you. I just wanted to protect you, even if it meant playing the bad guy in the background, even if it meant keeping my hands hidden." Sophie pulled her hands away, standing abruptly, her heart pounding. "I need to think, Daniel. I need space." His face tightened, his voice rough. "Soph, please, do not walk away. Not now, not when we have come this far." She shook her head, her throat tight. "I just need time, Daniel. I need to understand what this means. I need to figure out if I can trust that we are real, that we are not just another deal you managed to close." That night, Sophie left the penthouse, walking through the cold streets, her mind racing, her heart aching. She hated how much she missed him already, how much she wanted to run back and wrap her arms around him. But she also knew she needed to stand still for a moment, to ground herself, to remember that she was more than the girl Daniel had saved. She was someone who deserved to stand on equal ground. Daniel sat alone in his apartment long after she left. The lights dimmed, the city outside blurring into streaks of color. His hands clenched into fists as he cursed himself. He had fought so hard to build everything, to control every outcome, and now the one thing he wanted most was slipping through his fingers because he had not known how to let go. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Sophie buried herself in her art, sketching until her fingers ached, pouring her confusion, her anger, her longing into every line. Daniel buried himself in his work, returning to his relentless pace, his eyes shadowed, his smile gone. His team whispered about his mood, wondering what had changed, but no one dared ask. On the 10th day, Daniel made a decision. He left the office early, ignoring calls and emails, driving out of the city, heading to the small town where Sophie had gone to stay with her parents. He stood outside her childhood home, his heart pounding in his chest, wondering if she would slam the door in his face, wondering if he deserved it. Sophie opened the door slowly, her eyes wide, her breath catching. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I came to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. I am sorry, Sophie. I am sorry for trying to control everything. I am sorry for not trusting you with the truth. I am sorry for not trusting myself enough to just be vulnerable with you. I love you, not because you need saving, not because you are part of some promise, but because you are the only person who has ever made me want to be better, not richer, not stronger, just better." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her voice shaking. "You hurt me, Daniel. You let me think we were equals when you were still pulling the strings." He stepped closer, his eyes fierce. "Then let me show you I can stop. Let me show you I can stand beside you without trying to fix everything. Let me show you that I can love you without trying to own you." For a long moment they stood there, the cold wind tugging at their clothes, their hearts beating wildly. Then Sophie reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek, her voice soft. "I am scared, Daniel, but I do not want to be scared alone." His eyes softened, his hands closing gently around hers. "Then let us be scared together, Soph. Let us figure it out one day at a time." That night they sat on the old porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars appear one by one. No grand declarations, no promises of forever, just quiet, steady presence, just two people choosing to stay, choosing to try, choosing each other despite the fear, despite the past, despite the odds. Months passed and the rhythm of their lives shifted quietly as Daniel and Sophie learned how to move together not as a billionaire and a girl from a ruined family, but as two people who had chosen to stand side by side. Daniel no longer buried himself in work until midnight. He no longer saw victory in closing the next deal or winning the next acquisition. Instead, he found himself most alive on quiet mornings when Sophie sat beside him in his apartment sketching ideas, while he sipped coffee and read through documents, her bare feet tucked under her hair messy and her laugh soft. Sophie, too, discovered a version of herself she had almost forgotten. She began showing her artwork publicly, selling small pieces, building a reputation not as someone's girlfriend or someone's daughter, but as herself. She refused Daniel's offers to fund her projects, and he respected that, understanding at last that love was not about fixing or rescuing. It was about standing back and letting the person you loved shine. One evening they stood on the balcony of Daniel's penthouse, the city spread out below them, glowing and endless. Sophie leaned against the railing, her eyes thoughtful as the wind played with her hair. "I used to think love was something you earned," she murmured. "Something you had to work hard enough for, be good enough for." Daniel slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close, his voice low and steady. "I used to think love was something you survived, something you learned to protect yourself from because it could break you. Sophie smiled faintly, resting her head against his shoulder. But maybe it is neither. Maybe it is something you simply let happen, something you accept when it finds you. Daniel kissed the top of her head softly. Then thank you for letting me find you. Their journey was not perfect. There were still hard days, still old scars that ached when touched, still insecurities and fears that crept in late at night, but they faced those moments together, not as two broken halves trying to complete each other, but as two whole people learning to trust, to heal, to love without conditions. Sophie no longer felt small in his world. Daniel no longer felt the need to control every outcome. Together they built a life that was quiet and strong, a life where success was measured not by headlines or bank accounts, but by the simple, steady rhythm of waking up beside the person you loved and knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be. One morning, as they sat on the couch, Sophie curled against Daniel's side, sketching lazily while he read. She looked up suddenly, her eyes shining with mischief. "Do you remember the day I made you promise to come back for me?" she asked. Daniel chuckled, closing his book. "I remember everything about that day, Soph. I remember the way you stomped your foot and said you would wait. I remember the letter you slipped into my bag. I remember standing by that riverbank thinking I would never meet anyone who saw me the way you did." Sophie smiled softly, running her fingers along his jaw. "You know, I never expected you to actually keep that promise." Daniel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Well, I guess I have always been stubborn, and besides, some promises are worth everything." Sophie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. She realized then that their love had not been about the money, the sacrifices, or the dramatic twists. It had been about the quiet, consistent choice to stay, to try, to believe that even the most unexpected mistakes could become the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes love was not about grand gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes love was simply about showing up, day after day, and reminding each other, without words, I am here, and I am not going anywhere.